I have two verses in the Bible that are just deal breakers for omniscience. I mean, these are statements that I mean, the Bible is just self-refuting in hundreds of places. Jesus was crucified the day before the Passover meal. Jesus was crucified the day after the Passover meal. I mean, you just cannot make sense of these two claims. There's also the inconvenient fact that the most important and easily resolved moral conundrums are conundrums that the creator of the universe apparently gets wrong. So slavery is perhaps the most consequential and easiest moral problem we've ever had to confront. Slavery is supported in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New. The God of Abraham never envisioned a time where human beings ceased to keep slaves. That is a fact. And then Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was right to point out that theology was on the side of the slaveholders. I mean, it was despite theology that we got rid of slavery. Now, I want to talk to you for a minute before I wrap up about moral intuition and how it can seem to be confounded. Because people take the difficulties we have in answering moral problems as a sign that there can be no such thing as moral truth. And I want to argue that it's in fact a sign of no such thing. This is the trolley problem, which some of you have probably seen. A trolley is coming down the tracks. If you do nothing, it will hit and kill 5 people. But you stand at a switch, and you can throw the switch, diverting the trolley onto another track so that it kills only 1 person. So you would save a net 4 lives. Presented this way, something like 95% of people think you absolutely have to throw that switch. You would be a monster not to throw the switch. But the problem is you can present it another way. A trolley is coming down the track now, but you stand on a footbridge, and beside you is a suitably large fellow who you can push into the path of the oncoming trolley, killing him, unfortunately, but saving 5 workmen and a net 4 lives. Now, when presented this way, everyone's intuition seems to flip, and something like 95% of people think you would be a monster to push that man. I think this is actually somewhat ill-posed, because I think we have an intuitive physics, and most of us burn a lot of fuel worrying about whether the guy's really going to stop the trolley. But even if you stipulate that he will stop the trolley, and these are truly identical outcomes, it's still a problem for most people, and our intuitions get pushed around. Now, that is not a sign that there's no right answer to the trolley problem. I think, in fact, one of the details is that they are not equivalent, and it may just be different to push someone up close and personal than to throw a switch in terms of the consequences of everyone involved. I mean, in one scenario, you could wake up with nightmares for the rest of your life, and the other, you could think you're a hero. And if that's just a difference of human psychology, we have to take that into account in our evaluation of consequences. But consider what we do with our logical intuitions. This is the Monty Hall problem. How many of you have seen the Monty Hall problem? Okay, this is Berkeley. You're just taking Coles to Newcastle here. So you're on a game show, and you're given a choice of 3 doors. Behind one door is a new car. Behind the other 2 are goats. And you pick door number 1. Obviously, if you pick the car, you get to keep it. You pick door number 1, and Monty Hall then opens door number 2, revealing a goat, and he gives you a choice to switch your bet to door number 3. And how many of you think you should switch? How many of you think there's no reason to switch? Okay, well, there's a powerful intuition that many people, certainly many naive people share, that there's no reason to switch. Okay, there's 2 doors. We've got a car behind one, a goat behind the other. Why would you switch? It's a coin toss. Now, it turns out you should switch, and your chances double if you switch, because you had a 1/3 chance when you picked door number 1, and now the 2/3 chance has fully collapsed onto door number 3. But even very smart people, even mathematicians, people who understand probability theory, can just get led back into thinking, wait a minute, there's 2 doors, there's a car, there's a goat, why do you switch? And now, incidentally, it's easier to see if you imagine being confronted with 1,000 doors, and you pick door number 1, and then Monty Hall nullifies 998 doors, leaving door 576. Here, it's pretty obvious you've been given a ton of information, and switching makes sense. The point, however, is that the fact that our intuitions get pushed around never leads anyone to say, well, maybe there's no right answer to the Monty Hall problem. Maybe there's no such thing as logical truth. We're never tempted to do that. There are perceptual illusions that are truly reliable. Anyone who's got a clear shot of the screen sees the tower on the right leaning further to the right than the tower on the left, and yet these are the same photograph. We can get behind our failures of intuition in science. Our failures of intuition tell us a lot about how we're wired, in this case about how the visual system is organized. But there's no question that there are, just as there are perceptual illusions, there are moral illusions. And these are illusions that we have to find a way to get behind. This is based on research by Paul Slovic. He asked groups of people, how much would you give to help a little girl in need? Now, when you ask people that question, you get a maximum rating of empathy and a maximum donation. And if you ask a group how much would you give to help a little boy in need, you get the same response: maximum empathy, maximum donation. The problem, however, is that when you ask them how much they would give to a little girl and a little boy in need, you get a 25% diminishment in both self-reported empathy and material donation. I mean, our concern goes down by a quarter by adding another child. Now, this is clearly not a normative result. I mean, this is a bug, not a feature. I mean, if you care about a little girl and you care about a little boy, you should care at least as much about their combined fate. And it gets worse. The more kids you add, the more altruism and empathy diminishes. Now, this explains what Slovic has called genocide neglect, this fact about ourselves that many of us have noticed, that we find genocides boring. I mean, we do not have the attentional and emotional resources to pay attention to the left, and yet these are the same photograph. We can get behind our failures of intuition in science. Our failures of intuition tell us a lot about how we're wired, in this case about how the visual system is organized. But there's no question that there are, just as there are perceptual illusions, there are moral illusions. And these are illusions that we have to find a way to get behind. This is based on research by Paul Slovic. He asked groups of people, how much would you give to help a little girl in need? Now, when you ask people that question, you get a maximum rating of empathy and a maximum donation. And if you ask a group how much would you give to help a little boy in need, you get the same response: maximum empathy, maximum donation. The problem, however, is that when you ask them how much they would give to a little girl and a little boy in need, you get a 25% diminishment in both self-reported empathy and material donation. I mean, our concern goes down by a quarter by adding another child. Now, this is clearly not a normative result. I mean, this is a bug, not a feature. I mean, if you care about a little girl and you care about a little boy, you should care at least as much about their combined fate. And it gets worse. The more kids you add, the more altruism and empathy diminishes. Now, this explains what Slovic has called genocide neglect, this fact about ourselves that many of us have noticed, that we find genocides boring. I mean, we do not have the attentional and emotional resources to pay attention to the greatest occasions of human misery. And yet we have endless resources to pay attention to the story of one little girl trapped in a well. This is an image that perhaps many of you are too young to recognize, but this is baby Jessica pulled from a well. For something like 120 hours, she was in this well, and there was just wall-to-wall television coverage. I mean, everyone with a television was desperate to see how this was going to turn out. And yet, 800,000 people can be hacked to death in Rwanda, and if it even makes the news, we can barely pay attention to it. This is something that we have to engineer our better selves into our laws and our social institutions so that we can protect ourselves from our moment-to-moment failures of moral intuition. So, to conclude, I would point out that the moment we admit that there are right answers to questions of human well-being and that morality relates to this domain of facts, then we have to admit that certain people care about the wrong things. Which is to say that certain people, certain individuals, subcultures, and even whole cultures, perhaps, care about things that reliably produce needless human misery. And it seems to me that the only way we're going to converge on a truly common project and build a global civilization in which we can live toward the same shared values is to admit that this intellectual terrain exists, to admit that morality relates to questions of well-being, and well-being relates to how we are at some basic level, and how the universe is. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I guess I got to be first here.
Please.
Sam, in many of the speeches, it's sort of the same theme. You know, there's some quest for some type of universal truth based on science, and then there's also putting down all the other moral systems that religion has that obviously don't work, you know, completely. Some work to some extent, and some work to the other. But did you know that there's already a system written of morality based on science? And if you look it up, you know, you can put yourself like way ahead of the game because it's already been done. What
is that system?
Church of Reality.
Church of Reality, okay.
Church of Reality.
Okay.
Look at the website.
Okay.
It's something I started about 12 years ago.
I've heard of the Church of Reality, but...
Okay, but you got to read the website because it's more than just the name.
Sure.
It started out as just the name.
Okay.
But then it occurred to me like it occurred to you.
Well, I'm inclined to shorten it a bit to just reality.
Well, I know that.
And then I think we can talk about it.
I know people turn off when they hear the word church, but I put the word church in there because I wanted to get the attention of the religious world so that I can win souls for Darwin.
Well, I mean, we're clearly on the same team, and I wish you the best of luck with it.
Okay, but here's the thing about it is that.
Yes. Apologies, but there's a very long line forming behind you. So
I understand,
but everyone can go to the website.
If you read the site, I have built a complete moral system based on science.
Okay.
Read the site.
Thank you.
Bertrand Russell said, philosophy is basically gorging upon the stew of every conceivable idea. And recently Peter Hacker had an article that kind of followed that up, dealing with how language kind of confounds a lot of our problems by creating nonsense.
Right.
How much of that do you think is sort of inherent in the whole problem with creating a science out of religion, and that a lot of people who have objections seem to be basing their objections on things that really are more tricks of language than actual...
Yeah, it's a huge problem. It's people have associations with words that are very difficult to correct for in an elegant way, and people have, for instance, and this is true in science as well. I run into scientists who think that the difference between subjective and objective is hugely important, and that subjectivity, in some sense, can never be understood scientifically. I mean, this happens more among physicists than
Maybe the qualia problem.
yeah, yeah. It's just that how would we ever understand what it's like to be another person? And it's just there's some very philosophically unsophisticated views, even in among very smart scientists. And I mean, that one is this is a crucial distinction that I'll just briefly go into. We use words like subjective and objective in two very different ways. Actually, a local giant here, John Searle, is the first to make this point, at least in my hearing. We talk about subjectivity and objectivity ontologically, which is to say in terms of what exists, but we also talk about it epistemologically in terms of how we know things. And so ontologically, there are objective facts, third-person facts about the physical world, and there are subjective facts, facts about what it's like to be a certain conscious creature. And we can talk about both of those honestly and searchingly and in the context of science. The epistemological subjective and objective difference is where bias and personal views, and I like chocolate and you like vanilla, and why do you how should I cut my hair? And I mean, all of this, those kinds of questions, merely personal, merely subjective. The notion of subjectivity that diminishes truth claims, that has nothing to do with studying the nature of any conscious system. I mean, that's just, so we're using the difference between subjectivity and objectivity in very confusing ways, and so people think, well, it's just merely subjective. That's just your opinion. Who can say what a good life is? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense when you talk about physical health, and it shouldn't make any sense when you talk about psychological health or the health of societies. Yeah.
Yeah, I have two hopefully brief questions. I hope you'll answer at least one. I think the point evangelist Christians might make, if they ever read your book, which is wishful thinking, I agree, is this. Even if there are theories of morality that do not depend on God, as you clearly demonstrate, they'll say they're not relevant. Why? Because without God to punish them, people will do whatever they like. As Dostoevsky, I'm sure people know, is often quoted as writing, if God is not, then all is permitted. So you still need religion, they would say, or at least a history of religion, even now in godless Denmark, for human beings to behave themselves. So how would you respond to that?
Right.
That's question one?
Well, actually, I just got to limit you to one because
Okay.
just the line behind you is daunting. Yeah, one, it's not true because clearly atheists can be motivated to be good in the same way. And in fact, the most secular societies on earth, in fact, the most atheistic societies on earth right now are societies in Western Europe that are characterized by highly moral behavior by any index you would use.
But they had a history of religion before.
Okay, but they've shed their history and they seem to be better for it. So that's inconvenient for the thesis. But clearly, there is a challenge here for us to want the right. I mean, there are people who are not capable of wanting what they should want, and there are psychopaths, right? There are people who have brain damage, which we're beginning to understand, and they don't feel empathy for other people. Okay, so certain people are not up to the challenge of living a wise and ethical life. And we have to understand that. Now, there are cultures that make there are ways of, undoubtedly ways of raising children, ways of talking to one another in the public sphere, and institutional mechanisms to put in place that can encourage the greatest number of people to want to collaborate freely and non-oppressively and creatively with everyone else. And that's the challenge for us. We have to build a global civilization that allows most of the people who want to do that to do that. And there's some obvious principles that are so obvious that they basically should be non-negotiable. Things like free speech and the rights of women. Those are probably not on the table to be doubted. And yet so many societies don't even have that. The most basic rudiments of building a sane sphere for public discourse. And so we have to, kind of the first pass of what we should do is what any sane person would want to do given all the facts. And the trade-offs between individuals and the collective, or between the free speech versus privacy, all of these things, there are difficult ethical dilemmas that we can run into at the margins or in our lives personally. But the biggest moves for us to make as whole cultures are so obvious, and they're moves that would lift every boat with the same tide. I mean, stopping nuclear proliferation, stopping our contribution to climate change, stopping the causes of war, stopping pandemics. All of these things are good for everybody. And so it's just, you don't need divisive religious dogmatism to help that project along. In fact, it's one of the most obvious things standing in its way, I think.
Thank you.
So the proof of concept visual you showed about the moral landscape, how do you think scientists, your peers or yourself, could get inspiration from that and actually come up with, say, a mathematical model or framework that will be ever evolving for sure? Something that we can start with so we can get something actionable out of the scientific research. I mean, I can't wait for the day where I could go to the BBC News website and be able to see the moral finding of the week with the, with the landscape visual there.
I mean, I think it's, in detail, it would certainly take a long time. But I think the most important moves, again, don't even require more data. I mean, we know that throwing battery acid in the face of little girls who want to learn to read is not a good thing to do. We don't have to scan anybody's brain to figure out that that's not really compassion and that's not really good for society. And so I think we have to just, the core move is to admit that there are right answers to the question of how human beings can live lives worth living.
I'm just appealing to the visual marketability of...
Well, I think it does. I mean, there are many things that fall out of it. One is just the many peaks, as I said, but there are other dynamics of it. There's the fact that we might often have to move downward in order to move upward to a higher place. And I think there's an evolutionary argument, for instance, that altruism could only have formed in communities that were warring with other communities. And so our core moral tool at the moment of caring to collaborate with one another within a group is no one would be tempted to say, well, there's just no truth there, or it's a sign of bigotry to criticize somebody's response to a banking crisis. I mean, clearly we're operating in a situation where there are truths and we just don't know them, and we're worried. And that's, so there's an analogous issue there with morality. But speaking personally, it's nowhere written that it's easy to be good, and we have other motives. I mean, we're selfish, and we want certain things that we know we probably shouldn't want, which is to say we would be happier and we wouldn't regret it if we could overcome these wants, but yet we still want, we want to lose weight, but we also want a hot fudge sundae. So we're multiform in our motives, and I think the most important move for all of us to make is in our most reflective moments to come up with an honest opinion about what should happen, and then to engineer that at the level of society, so that if our tax code dealt with the problem of how much we should be giving to homelessness, say, we wouldn't be having to recalculate every minute about whether we give or we don't give. I mean, we have to solve the problem of homelessness, to take one problem among myriad. There are more and less intelligent ways to address it. We clearly haven't discovered the way that is actionable, that is really going to work. But the idea that there's no way to address it seems frankly crazy. And the idea that we're all left with just deciding whether to take $1 out of our pocket, I mean, that's clearly not the remedy. And yet that's the kind of remedy, that's the kind of problem that each of us in the privacy of our own lives worries about in terms of our own ethical responsibility. I think the bigger swings are going to happen at the level of what we engineer at the level of society. But it's a hard problem. I mean, it's the koan we all have to solve moment to moment.
Mark Lewis, OptimalHumanValues.com. Thank you for your work, Sam, in this area. I see two central challenges to your basic premise or your basic conclusion that science can determine human values. One is the philosophical case, which I believe you address relatively effectively in your book. The second is, we could say, a fear that if we cede the realm of values to science,
Right.
that science will make a mistake and tell us to value the wrong thing, and in the process destroy things that are truly valuable and important. And the challenge that that poses seems to me, from the people I've spoken with about your book, has them not want to face the arguments in your book because they're afraid that if they listen to the arguments, that they'll have to see that.
Question. People have creepy associations with the word science, and they think what I'm advocating is a kind of brave new world scenario where everyone's just going to be medicated with the right drug. Science is our truly open conversation in which we are most constrained by honest observation and clear reasoning. I mean, it's when we make our best effort to get our biases out of the way, and our wishful thinking out of the way, and just talk honestly about what we know and what we don't know. And the suspicion that might, it's a very strange intuition that the most important questions in human life must fall outside of science, because what we're saying is that when you become most intellectually honest, when you get your wishful thinking out of the way, when you get your biases out of the way, when you rely upon clear reasoning and honest observation, that's precisely the mood you can't be in to address the most important questions in human life. Okay, that's weird, and we should point that out. There is no other mood to be in to address the most important questions, and science is, and so again, I don't define science narrowly. I'm defining it's evidence-based, rational discussion where people's convictions are going to scale with the quality of the arguments and the quality of the evidence, and that is really the antithesis of what happens in religion, and it's what's brought to really an exquisite refinement in science per se, but it's also true of all intellectual discourse, and so it's not about getting science. Your fear is, or the fear you're expressing, could be applied to medicine. We're all afraid that science is going to get human health wrong, and disease wrong, and cancer wrong. And it's possible to get these things wrong, but the remedy for getting them wrong is always just better science. It's better. It's understanding the facts more clearly, and the antidote is never some other process of irrational, faith-based claims about the nature of reality. So,
I hope you'll lead a forum to that end as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that vote of confidence.
Hi. I did want to preface this by saying that I am not a Muslim. I'm not any religion at all. But it bothered me when you were talking about Islam being not a religion of peace. Muhammad was a very peaceful man.
No, he wasn't.
Yes, well, if you read,
No,
yes,
no.
and he had a great respect for women. His wives were given a great deal of power over him. And
have you been reading Karen Armstrong? Is that where this is coming from?
No, I've read Karen Armstrong, but no. And, what's happening now with Islam is it's bastardized, just like all the other religions. But it bothers me that you
So you're saying the true Islam, if we could only return to it, would just nullify all of my concerns about Islam?
I don't think any religion is a good religion, but it bothers me that you singled Islam out, and that you said that that actually that Muhammad was a peaceful man.
Okay,
and
well,
that
Muhammad, who knows who Muhammad was? I mean, Muhammad's actually closer to history than Jesus and many of the other patriarchs, so we know more about him. But obviously there's a lot of uncertainty about what's factual. But the example of Muhammad, as held in Islam universally, is not of a pacifist. He was a conquering warlord who spread the faith with the sword quite successfully. And the expectation is this is a way of being in the world that is by example totally justified. Now this is different from Jesus. Jesus did not spread the faith with a sword. He was essentially a hippie who got crucified. Now that's a different example, and it's a difference that is a benefit to Christianity at the moment, because Christianity, in Christianity, you can come up with a rationale for saying, listen, it's not about conquering the world. It's not about winning in this life. We just got to wait for Jesus to come back and get raptured. But you can't really do that in Islam. Christianity has a line like, render unto God that which is God, and unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And that line from Matthew, has done huge work to separate Christianity from claim upon terrestrial power. Now, it's imperfect work, and there are a lot of crazy Christians who want terrestrial power, but at least there's some rationale within Christianity for doing that. That rationale doesn't exist in Islam. There is no line in the Quran which says, listen, guys, this is not about politics, it's not about controlling people's lives. You can be privately religious and let everyone else flourish.
But the subjugation of women was not something that Muhammad was
interested in. You're just not. Please just go read the Quran and read some significant. Okay, well then surely you read the part in the Quran which talked about husbands scourging or whipping, depending on the translation, their wives who are disobedient. Now,
that's in Judaism also.
What was that? Okay, but so it's in Judaism, but I will grant you that the worst books ever written were in the Old Testament. Okay, but there's a reason why Jews are not stoning their wives for adultery at this moment in history, and we can talk about those reasons. What I said about Islam was intended to counter exactly the presuppositions you are now bringing to me. I don't have time to do it here, but I can only invite you to read more on the subject, because we are deluding ourselves with a lot of wishful thinking. We are desperate to believe that all of the problems in the world are of our own making. If we could just spread more money around and behave better on the global stage, people will treat us well, and that everyone wants the same thing, and it's all a matter of just more education, and this religion is intrinsically benign. It's just not true. And Osama bin Laden, the crucial, I've said this, but I should say it again. The real problem is that Osama bin Laden is giving a very plausible version of the faith. Now, you can split a few hairs and say, well, listen, apostates shouldn't be killed unless they speak kind of endlessly against the faith. But the penalty for apostasy is death under Islam. And there's no school of Islam which says, oh, no, we don't mind apostates. That just doesn't exist. There's no Reformed Judaism version of Islam. That's a huge problem. It's a problem that has to be solved by Muslims. That we can't help them solve it by just lying to ourselves about the nature of their religion.
I also want to say one more thing. It's on the
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Sorry.
You good to keep going?
Yeah. I don't. Maybe. There's no way we'll get to the back of the line, so I'm going to let you decide. But I'm long-winded, and sorry.
Yeah. I'll try to be short-winded. Thank you for your books. It made a huge impact on me. And your breaking down of taboos has been phenomenal. In this book, which I enjoyed very much, one thought kept nagging at me, and I just want some clarification.
Sure.
When I think of this moral landscape, and your visual is in my mind, it seems to assume, or I think it doesn't assume, but intuitively it assumes like that the elevation starts the same, right? And the question that you just brought up, actually, of resources, some people think you can just spread money around, kept coming to mind. And I thought of, I'm sure you encountered Robert Sapolsky at Stanford.
Yeah.
And his work with looking at the same species of monkey. You know, we are ourselves biped primates, right? You think of, I thought of this example that he has of these monkeys that in an arid, barren environment take risks more, are more aggressive, have a different social
Yeah, oh,
network.
yeah.
And then in a more rich and resource-rich environment are more forgiving and equitable and so on. And I kept thinking, I'm with you so much on this project, but when I get to the prescriptive part, we, I think, we can break down the fact-value distinction and say very clearly, we don't like people doing X, Y, and Z, either in a subculture domestically or internationally, you know, Taliban or anywhere else. And however, are there situations in that moral landscape where some community will have organized its... I'm sorry?
Just continue. Yeah.
Will organized itself in some kind of optimal or suboptimal, but somewhat utility maximizing way, but it's abhorrent to us. And how do we deal with that? Resource question.
Well, good question. I think there are clearly islands of sort of pathological happiness. I mean, the example from Auschwitz was one. You get the guards of Auschwitz all together agreeing that they're loving life. Clearly, that can't be a peak on the moral landscape, because all of that well-being, such as it is predicated on just an immensity of suffering occasioned outside that circle. And I think there are some obvious kinds of happiness that people like that are not experiencing. I mean, they're not. I mean, there's insofar as compassion and a connection to other people is a source of well-being. And I think there are probably frontiers for all of us to discover there, just how happy and connected it's possible to be in the midst of others. It's clearly not a peak. So we can grant that there's sort of weird areas where people, based on isolation and based on what they've established culturally, you could get an island of perfectly matched sadists and masochists, say, where it just some people just like to be beaten on and some people just like to mistreat them, and they're just perfectly matched and pretty happy, but clearly it's not a peak, and clearly that kind of valuation of experience isn't really well packaged for export. And I think it's not an accident that I think we can converge, just as we converge on logical understanding of basic facts and in a scientific understanding of the world. We don't converge perfectly. I mean, obviously, it's not even in certain situations, it's not even a majority of people who converge. 25% of Americans think evolution is a fact. The rest apparently don't. But biology can still thrive in that context. And I think it's possible that there are moral truths that even a majority may not be up to realizing, but they may still be true, just as there are medical truths that a majority may not be up to understanding, but they're true. And we have to find some way of just as we want to empower the biologists to talk about real biology, even though they would get voted out of office if their neighbors could, we have to empower the people who really understand the danger of nuclear proliferation, say, and know that it's worthy of our attention and gay marriage isn't, to prioritize those things at the level of public policy. And but it's I mean, I think there are probably weird places and weird things to pass through in order to advance. But I mean, what's the alternative? I mean, all we have is human conversation, where we're trying to influence one another to share a common project of peaceful cooperation.
I guess it would refrain from some of the harsh judgment, recognizing that in situations of lack of resources.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't deal with that piece. Clearly, material resources are a huge variable in. I mean, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, if you're starving, you really don't have the free attention to worry about whether stealing is right and wrong, whether you should value other people's children as much as your children, or how much should you discount their hunger over your children's. I mean, you can't think about human happiness when you're starving. And so and you can't think about human happiness when you're being chased by somebody wielding a machete. You're just reacting. And so we need to create the most basic conditions of stability in any society where people then have the free attention to worry about things like education and creativity and how they should act so as to maximize their well-being in society.
Thank you. Let's do 2 more quick questions because
Sure.
we want you to stay and sign books after this.
Okay.
Thank you. This is the Brave New World question.
Okay.
If I understand your premise that morality is based on the experience of human happiness or the experience of the reduction of suffering, then how do you distinguish a drug-induced experience of happiness from
question.
a reality-based one?
Well, I think we want our subjective states of well-being to be coupled to reality for very obvious reasons, because if they're not coupled to reality, then they're vulnerable to the next insult from reality. So why not just take heroin all day long? It's a very pleasant state to be in. You could just keep doing it. Well, the problem is you can't just keep doing it, and you can't attend to all the other things you value in life that are your sources of happiness, like your relationships, like having a career, like not dying. I mean, it's not a stable source of well-being, and most of what we care about in life, like loving other people and experiencing love in return, is predicated on our states of consciousness actually tracking the reality of our lives. Not perfectly, perhaps, but to a significant degree. You can't have real relationships if you're delusional, or if you're stoned all the time. I mean, there's a and this is something we actually will face. I mean, we will get drugs that can really, for instance, take away grief. I think at some point in the lifetime of someone in this room, there will be an antidote to sadness. So that when your wife dies and you're inconsolable, there will be a pill you can take that will take that feeling away. Now the question is, when do you want to take it? You want to take it 15 minutes after she dies? You want to take it a month after? You want to take it a year after? You want to take it before she dies so that you'll be indifferent to her dying? I mean, these are real ethical problems. But
that movie, The Matrix, kind of created a scenario where the people who were living in this drug-induced world, it was complete. They didn't need reality to
okay, but that's not our situation in any foreseeable future. I mean, if Ray Kurzweil is right, if the singularity is true, and Ray Kurzweil is right, and we're just going to upload ourselves onto the internet in 30 years or whatever it is, well, then that's a real challenge. The question is, what connection to reality do we want if we can really sort of disappear into this dreamscape where our happiness can be perfectly maintained? That's my moral intuitions get a little shaky there, but in some sense, we're in a bit of a dreamscape already. I mean, all of this is being run on our brains, and we have to creatively respond to the opportunity to experience happiness and avoid suffering in this space.
The second logical premise, which is the experience of...
I'm saying, well, the answer to your question is, in our context, we want to be truth tracking to a significant degree for obvious reasons, because the moment we're not, we begin to suffer mightily. And if that ever ceases to be true, well, then we can have a conversation about what reality we want to live in. But at the moment, we're living in this one, and we have to understand how we're entangled with it, or we'll suffer.
Thank you. Please stay seated in your seats for one last question.
Kind of feel like the chosen one here. I want to ask a question because I'm trying to understand if you're claiming that there is one moral truth for a given action, or if there could be multiple opposing ones, because I can imagine some sort of moral dilemma that can have a positive well-being effect on one person,
Right.
while at the same time having a negative well-being effect on the other.
That's true.
And, you know, I'm trying to understand if you're claiming that there is only one. Can there be multiple? Can they be opposing? Is it not absolute? Because I'm sort of getting the impression that you're saying it's absolute. So.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that for that case, there are clearly zero-sum moments where there's one slice of pie left and only one person is going to get it, and if person A gets it, person B doesn't, and vice versa. I think there are probably right solutions. If we could understand human well-being in a truly fine-grained way, there are probably right solutions to most of those. I mean, either it doesn't matter who gets it in the scheme of things, or it'd be a little bit better if one person got it, or it'd be much better if one person got it. So when it really matters, I think that the trade-offs begin to get obvious. But even there are situations in which some people really want something, and some people really want its antithesis, and there's going to be some obvious suffering either way you play it. Now,
I'm thinking of like a euthanization sort of situation, right, where you have a lifetime of pain versus just ending, someone's life. I mean, never mind even the effects on other family members and things, but you've got those two things. How does science tell us, based on your claim, which one of those we should value more?
Well, I think
less bad, I suppose I should say.
Well, again, it would be science narrowly described as a mature science of the human mind. Well, then it would have a lot to say. But I mean, we will be able to we'll know how much people suffer. The person suffering will be able to will say, I'm suffering this much, and we'll have our suffering detector, which says, yeah, they are suffering that much, and boy, does that suck. But short of that, all we can do is talk honestly about the trade-offs here. But what I'm really trying to fight for is the trade-offs are in terms of human well-being. They're not in terms of something else. So if you're going to advance a moral argument, you have to at least talk that talk, otherwise it's not a moral argument. So if you're going to oppose gay marriage, say, and say there's all these trade-offs and who knows what is true, at least your side of the argument has to be, here is all the suffering that gay marriage is going to cause. Okay, this is what's going to happen to children if they get adopted by gay people. This is what's going to happen to... There's no burden on anyone to make that argument at the moment, because we're living in a world where the President of the United States can say, my faith tells me that marriage is between a man and a woman. End of argument. Okay, that's the move that should no longer be open to smart people, and certainly people with responsibility in our society.
Thank you. I'm sorry we have to stop now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.